Hello again, everyone. I'm Professor Robert Romano, and welcome back to Sports History. When we last let off, we were talking about the 1936 Summer Olympic Games that were held in Berlin, Germany. The importance of those games for us as sports managers to study, analyze, and see how they did things right, and mostly how they did things wrong during those games. Moving forward from those games, though, things continued to be interesting for us as sports managers. Post World War II, coming out of the 36 games, we went into World War II in 1940. The games during that period were suspended. They came back in 1948 and were held in London, but it was hard for various nations to send athletes because everybody was devastated by the war. The Eastern Bloc nations and Russia did not send their athletes to the games. They did not want to participate in the games. All right, so the USSR, Russia, shunned the games, and they said they were a Western capitalist creation that they didn't want to be part of. And with them, the other Eastern Bloc nations also did not participate. So the games were kind of limited in scope coming out of World War II. By 1952, though, however, the Helsinki Games, Avery Brundage, yes, he's back again, was elected president of the IOC. He was the president of the USOC. Now he was elected president of the IOC, the International Olympic Committee. And his position was that the Olympics, again, as most presidents, Olympics should stay out of politics. It must not be used by nations for their own self-purposes. And what he said was kind of interesting. All his time in sport, he said he never knew or heard of a single athlete who was too poor to participate in the Olympic Games. Again, getting back to that elite amateur kind of concept. This elite attitude towards these games. So, 1952, Avery Brundage was elected president of the IOC, the International Olympic Committee. Important for us to know as sports managers. All right. He was steadfast on this concept of amateurism, this elite amateurism, and he thought that athletes being used for commercial purpose was a violation of the rights of man. All right. He also was against paying college athletes because he thought that would destroy the spirit of loyalty and the satisfaction that comes with successful play, the fun of it. All right. So like kind of how we analyze the mind of Coubertin. We're also got to get into the mind of Avery Brundage, as he is now the leader, albeit 50 years later, and now he is the leader of the IOC. All right, so the 1952 games, the question became, should the IOC allow Russia into the games? Right? Should they allow the USSR back into the games? They did not compete in 1948. So as sports managers, what would your argument be for allowing the USSR or Russia to be back in the games in order for them to compete? I mean, what arguments can you come up with? And then what arguments against? All right, so take a minute, think about that. If you're a sports manager, you are sports managers, why would you want the USSR or Russia in the games? Well, to bring more competitors, right? More successful game. You want the best athletes. More exposure for sport. More money possibly to be brought into the sports. All right, so those are some good arguments. What are some arguments against? Well, the arguments against were that the USSR was bringing in professionals. Okay, all right. So the amateur status was now being questioned, and now sport will be used as a weapon for international affairs. Right, using this as a competition between the two superpowers, between the West and the East. So, the argument for is you want to build up the quality of a competition. Of course you do. But is this also setting the stage for this superpower battle where the competition between these would overshadow the goodwill of the games? And then multiply that and think about that in the context that we were sending amateur athletes, right? We were still sending college athletes and amateur athletes. But were the Russians and were the Eastern Bloc nations necessarily sending amateur athletes? So, what it came to be was that the athletes that the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc nations were sending were, for all intents and purposes, professional. Right? They were well paid. They got well paid government positions or positions within the military And within that position, they were then allowed to practice and build their skills and do everything that they needed to do to make themselves better for international competition. They were got housing, food. They were given jobs after retirement. So, for all intents and purposes, the athletes that the Eastern Bloc nations and the Soviet Union was sending were for professionals. Now we have professionals competing against purely amateur athletes, and as you can see, this grew over time. The Soviet Union set up specialized sports schools, and by 1991, 40 years later, 6,000 sports schools trained students for Olympic competition. Wow! How would you like to go to a sports school where you basically, you spend your day learning and practicing, getting educated and then getting educated in your sport. So there were 6,000 sports schools, not 6,000 athletes, 6,000 sports schools who trained students for Olympic competition. It's kind of like an unfair advantage that the Eastern Bloc nations had over the West. Over that period of time, the Soviet Union competed in 9 summer games. 7 times they became in first in the medals. They ranked twice, 2 other times. Same for the Winter Games, right? And this gave the Soviets a way to use the games as propaganda, the same way Hitler did, right? As confirmation of their superiority over the Western nations, all right? Communism over capitalism. So, was this really the purpose of the games, though? Think about it from a sports manager perspective. Was this really how the games were to be conducted? Politics are supposed to stay out of sport, right? It was supposed to bring the world together in sport and keep politics away. And in reality, they were used as a conduit for political purposes, right? Showing superiority of one over another. All right, so let's fast forward now, right? The Olympics are happening, and there's 2 Olympiads that I really want to speak to within this lecture. The first one was the 1968 Summer Olympic Games in Mexico City. All right, leading up to the games, it was a very interesting time here in the United States. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed, which stated that you cannot discriminate against anyone based on the race, creed, color, etc. So, we were going through a volatile time here. Just because we passed the civil rights law doesn't mean that everybody was being treated fairly. All right, so because this continued, racism and social justice issues continued, even though the Civil Rights Act was passed, leading up to the 1968 Games, the Olympic Project for Human Rights was created. All right, and this is an interesting thing if you've never heard about the Olympic Project for Human Rights. And they had a set of demands that they wanted, right? In 1967, they said that they wanted Ali to be restored, right? At this time, he was banned from boxing. So because he wouldn't fight in Vietnam, they said, no, one of the things we want is Ali to be able to regain his heavyweight title. They wanted Avery Brundage removed. They wanted South Africa banned from the games because of apartheid, and which they were. They wanted more people of color, black coaches in track and field. They wanted people of color on the USOC. If not, they threatened that black athletes or people of color would boycott the 1968 Games. So, wow, from a sports management perspective, you're thinking about all this, right? The Olympic Project for Human Rights, leading up to the 1968 Games, they feel that civil rights is not moving fast enough. There's still discrimination. There's still racism. There's still poverty. So they say, well, you know what? If we want people of color to compete, great. We'll do something for us. Make sure that there's some coaches. Make sure there are people on the USOC. Make sure that Brundage is gone. I can go on and on about how my feelings on Brundage. Not a very nice man, to say the least, in my opinion. All right, so think about this. You're a sports manager. Would you send your athletes? I mean, now if you were a person of color, would you want to compete? Right, so all these things were going on leading up to the 1968 Games. And then when we get there, one of the most iconic things happens in sport. The 1968 Summer Olympic Games in Mexico City, the silent gesture, right? The raised fist. Right? So what happened was Tommy Lee and John Carlos raised their fist in protest. But why? Why? And what would you do if you were part of the USOC? the United States Olympic Committee. What would you do if you were part of the IOC? Is this a big deal? Should it be considered a big deal? So Tommy Lee and John Carlos stood in their socks on the podium. If you didn't notice, they're standing on their socks. Right? Look at that. Their shoes are off to the side behind them. They're raising their fists with the black gloves. Right? And they did this. There's so many symbolic things within this big picture. They stood in their socks to symbolize poverty. Right? They raised their black gloved fist to symbolize black pride, and also to show strength and unity. All right, so this is very symbolic, right? You're on there, you're in front of the world, right? You got your one shot. Are you gonna just, look up at the flag, put your hand on your heart, and call it a day, or are you gonna make a statement? Are you gonna do something to show that civil rights is here, but it's not fair yet? All right, so they stood in their socks to symbolize poverty, raised their black gloved fist. They bowed their heads and opened their jackets. And they did this to symbolize their working class roots. And the working class roots of many, many, many of the athletes that were there. You think about it, in the late 1800s, leading in the first part of the 20th century, it was the elite amateurs, the rich that could compete. And now it's the working class people who are competing. Right? That kind of definition changed. Beads around their neck symbolize the history of lynching in the United States. Pretty powerful statement. All right, so Tommy Lee and John Carlos both wore human rights buttons on their jackets, if you noticed. And so did the silver medalist Peter Norman of Australia. He wore that same pin. All right, he sported a button of solidarity, as he called it. All right, so why would they do this, right? Why would they use this time when they're getting their medals in the Olympics to make a political statement, to speak out on social injustice, to speak out on injustices, to speak out on social issues and poverty? Why would they do this? Well, they said because we need to regain our dignity, our black dignity. We need to bring attention to the plight of people who are less fortunate. And not just in the United States, but around the world, right? To wake up the consciousness of those who had let their consciences go dormant. Interesting statement, right? It's easy just to sit back and say, oh, whatever. I don't have to worry about that. I just want to watch the games. No, it's more than that. We're sports managers. We need to think about this stuff. When the athletes go to the games in 2 weeks and they speak out, they raise a fist, they take a knee, they turn their back to the flag, they say, I'm an activist athlete. What does that actually mean? And what could be done as sports managers? All right, so think about this. They wanted to encourage people to stand up for what was right, as opposed to standing for nothing. It's easy. They did this all to protest poverty and racism that plagued the United States. Right? All to protest poverty and racism that plagued the United States and the world. Right? This is a symbolic thing. About 2 months ago, I was in a conference with John Carlos, and someone asked him, not me, but someone asked him, and they were like, why did you use this time to raise your fist? And he said, well, listen, the athletes today, they can get on social media, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, whatever it is, and speak to the world. I had one opportunity to speak to the world, and I took it. Interesting. All right. Now, what would you think the IOC's reaction to this? If you were head of the IOC, Avery Brundage in this case, what would you do? Is this an issue? Is this a big deal? Well, Brundage, who's not part of the USOC at this time, he's a member of the IOC now. So you got to think about that too. Now, if you're a member of the USOC, what would you do? If you're head of the USOC, what would your concerns be? Well, Brundage put pressure on the USOC to suspend and remove the two athletes from the Olympic Village. All right, Brundage said, get rid of them, send them out of here, suspend them, and get them out and send them back to the United States. And the USOC initially pushed back, but then relented. All right. And they came out and said that this was an untypical exhibitionism and it violates the basic standards of sportsmanship and good manners. Maybe. And they did what Brundage requested, sent the athletes home. They didn't take away their medals, but they sent them home. Was this the right thing or the wrong thing to do? Should you allow your athletes to use the Olympics to promote messages of equality, messages of social justice, messages of against poverty? Or do you just say, as some people say, shut up and dribble, right? I don't know if that's actually a nice thing to say to anyone. But so I want you to think about this as sports managers, because you got to balance. Is our political statements allowable, or should they be allowed at the Olympics? But what's too much? When does it overshadow the games, where we want to bring the world together in sport? Interesting concepts for us. All right. Carlos and Smith paid a high price for their actions. They received death threats. They were pillared in the press. When they came back to the United States, they really couldn't get a job. It took a while for them to be accepted by the United States community. All right. Norman also, he went back to Australia. He was immediately cut from the team, to the point when the games came to Sydney in 2000, not 200. When the games came to Sydney in 2000, they didn't even acknowledge him as a medal winner. All right, so we're talking 30 years later. So but as time went on, they're finally recognized for their sacrifice. Right, there's the statue of them out in California, raising their fist in protest, raising their fist to create awareness. So, for us as sports managers, we need to think about this. How we're going to handle athletes speaking out when Colin Kaepernick takes a knee, or an athlete wears a shirt that says "I can't breathe," or many messages out there that are being used by athletes, especially on social media, to say, listen, things aren't fair and something needs to be done about it. All right, so we need to think about that. All right. All right, so yeah, again, us as sports managers, if you're in the NFL, how would you handle this? Okay, so let's get to the 1972 games. All right, so what I'm going to ask you, though, before we get into the 72 games, one of the questions I may ask you on the quiz is, how would you handle a political statement by an athlete at the games? I mean, if you were the head of the USOC, what would you do depending on the political statement that is being made? All right, so really want you to think about that. All right, let's move forward 4 more years. All right, 4 years, the Summer Olympic Games are in Munich, Germany. All right, now just think about this, right? We're coming out of World War II. World War II ends in 1945. The Germans again are on the losing side against the United States, France, or England, Canada, and a bunch of other nations. Similar to World War II, right? World War I. But again, the IOC says, well, let's give the games to Germany. Did it work out so well in 1936? No, not so much, right? So why did they do it again, right? The 1972 games were, 25, 27 years outside of World War II. And again, they have the games to help build their nation and bring them back into the fold. But what happens is this Munich massacre. All right, the Munich massacre occurs. All right, so there's a reading I'm going to attach regarding this. Well, basically, a group of militant Palestinian group called Black September kidnapped and killed 11 Israeli coaches and athletes. Right? They broke into the Olympic Village. They kidnapped 11 Israeli coaches and athletes and had a series of demands. Now think about this. If you're the head of the IOC, what do you do about this? This is happening while your games are occurring. Do you stop the games? Do you allow the games to continue? Right? I mean, 11 over a period of time. And, I posted that video. Please watch it, A Day in September. It's a powerful, powerful documentary. What would you do? Should you... 11 athletes were killed. Do you continue with the games? Avery Brundage decided to continue at the game. He said, well, okay, we're just going to continue. Really, is that the right thing to do? I mean, you got to think about it from all perspectives, politically, from the athletes who trained and sacrificed for the 4 years. All these different viewpoints. It's just the right thing to do. Now, what would you do if you were the head of the USOC? Would you take your athletes out of there? Would you get them to safety? If you had Jewish athletes, would you get them out of there? Would you take them to safety? You know, in the documentary, it shows taking Mark Spitz out of the country. He was the swimmer of he was of the Jewish faith, and they said, you know what, it may be best that we get him out of the country for his own safety. So these are issues that you're going to have to think about, and think about quickly when these things happen. What do you do? Do you protect the games, or do you protect your athletes? Do you protect the sponsors? Do you protect the TV rights holders? I mean, all these people have some input and have a stake in these games. All right. So, for today, I'd like you to watch the documentary, A Day in September. Get a real feel for what it was like during the 1972 games, the horror of it, how 11 people died. And you'll notice one of them is named Joseph Romano. Just pointing that fact out. Okay, that's enough for now. And if you have any questions, comments, criticisms, whatever, please feel free to contact me, and we'll go from there. Thank you very much.